Good afternoon. I'm Kate Narveson, president of Luther College's Ada of Iowa chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2021 Phi Beta Kappa initiation ceremony and to the Ruth A. Davis Memorial Lecture, given this year by Dr. Nancy Jones, class of 1969. Before we begin, I have an announcement, and I will also share a brief history of Phi Beta Kappa. The announcement deserves a fanfare. We have received a large gift in honor of Dr. Mary Hull Moore, Professor Emerita of English. Mary Lou was the driving force behind the founding of the Luther chapter and guided it wisely for many years, even after her retirement in 2000. This announcement, though, is bittersweet, for we lost Mary Lou only a few weeks ago on Friday, April 1st, and she's not with us to hear that the chapter has decided to name the fund in her honor as the Mary Hull Moore Endowment for Phi Beta Kappa. We are deeply grateful to Mary Lou and to the anonymous donor, both of whom have left a lasting mark on our organization. Next, a few words about the organization to which you're being inducted. As liberally educated people, we know the importance of a public sphere, a community gathering place, to the genesis of great ideas. Having all read Plato, we know that often enough this gathering place is a symposium, somewhere that serves wine, or in the US, beer. The genesis of the idea for Phi Beta Kappa is true to form. On December 5th, 1776, a group of 5 young men, students at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, violated college rules by meeting in the Apollo Room of the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, where they formed the Phi Beta Kappa Society, pledging themselves to, quote, that freedom of inquiry that ever dispels the clouds of falsehood by the radiant sunshine of truth. In subsequent years, chapters were established at Yale, Harvard, Dartmouth, Union, Bowdoin, and Brown. By the mid-19th century, having swelled to 25 chapters, the need for closer unity led to the organization of the national body, now called the Phi Beta Kappa Society. At present, there are over 300 chapters at colleges and universities nationwide, with a membership of over 500,000. In 1875, the Society extended membership to women. In 1926, to mark the 150th anniversary, the Society began to raise an endowment fund and to explore ways to encourage scholarship. The Society today works to defend freedom of teaching and inquiry, and it is a leading advocate of the liberal ideal in education. At Luther College, we are beneficiaries of another of its initiatives, the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program, which has brought distinguished lecturers to our campus almost every year since our chapter was founded. Most recently, a prize-winning economist and a path-breaking primate anthropologist. The original organization at William and Mary was a secret society. But in the 1830s, most of the branches repealed the injunction to secrecy, and you may tell your parents that you are now going to be a member of Phi Beta Kappa. They kept, however, hi parents. The society kept, however, the medal or key with its symbolic engraving, and the interpretation of these symbols has continued to be part of the initiation ceremony. So, on one side, the key bears the Greek letters Phi Beta Kappa, the initials of the words Philosophis Bio Kubernetes. Love of wisdom is the helmsman of life, or as we say now, the guide of life. In the upper left corner, 3 stars symbolize the aims of the society: friendship, morality, literature. A pointing hand in the lower corner symbolizes aspiration. On the reverse side, the letters SP represent the second motto of the society, Societas Philosophiae. Below them is engraved the historic date, December 5th, 1776, and above them is the name of the member. That would be you. The Ada of Iowa chapter at Luther College was founded in 1983. The members in course initiated today, which is you, bring the total number of Luther College students and other honorees to 1,947. I'll close with a personal note about the significance of Phi Beta Kappa. I vaguely remember when I was a senior sitting through a ceremony like this one, but I was preoccupied with my senior thesis and didn't stop to find out more about Phi Beta Kappa. I'd read references here and there. It was one of those credentials that got listed along with summa cum laude and honorary degrees. Later, as a member, I'd skim the newsletter mainly because of the book reviews, which assume that members keep the intellectual curiosity that got you guys where you are, and that people like you might want to pick up a book on astrophysics or the Harlem Renaissance or medieval Chinese architecture. It wasn't until I started teaching here at Luther that I realized the role the society plays as an advocate for the liberal arts. To qualify as a Phi Beta Kappa institution, a college has to satisfy the national organization that a rich general education is the heart of their mission, even if they have programs that lead toward a profession, like our music, education, and nursing programs. When the Luther faculty looks at our graduation requirements, our status as a Phi Beta Kappa college helps keep us focused on our higher vision of what education is for, the whole person. People who will be versatile, creative, and disciplined. People who look beyond their immediate situation, who will be interested in the public sphere and want to contribute to the common good. And people who simply love learning stuff. Welcome to a society of eager minds. And now, to my fellow members of Phi Beta Kappa who are also in the audience, we are assembled for the purpose of receiving into the membership of our society certain persons who, having been duly elected by this chapter, desire to be admitted to its privileges and opportunities. My co-president, Professor Marie Drews, will introduce the candidates.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome to all our family members and friends near and far. We're really happy you could join us for this virtual event. You Luther College students who have been elected to membership in course in accordance with the rules of this chapter and in consequence of our good opinion of your intellectual and moral character, supported by your record of high attainment in the college, have been selected as worthy of becoming members of Phi Beta Kappa. Your names have been submitted to the scrutiny of the constitutional electors of the chapter and have met with their approval. You have been formally notified of your election, and by your virtual presence here, you signify your desire to be enrolled as members of this old and honorable society. As we gather together in the CFL lobby following this ceremony, I invite each of you to receive your certificate, which signals your pledge to remain faithful to the Phi Beta Kappa motto, "The love of learning is the guide to life." Stephanie Almquist, Jacob Barsness, Levi Bird, Gretchen Blaine, Aaron Blumberg, Rachel Brolin, Emma Brooks, Courtney Cooper, Hannah Dodd, Laura Duffield, Annika Duncan, Emma Everett, Ryan Ferguson, Kayla Gibson, Caroline Handley, Karina Hansen, Emma Hitz Kelly, Isabel Iverson, Kari Jacobson, Stephen Johnson, Kylie Kurtenbach, Sydney Lear, Nick Lambeziter, Shauna Liu, Avery Pazur, Elena Pino, Alessandra Rogers, Benjamin Seavey, Lindsay Stouter, Michaela Teskey, Soren Glegg Torp, David Will, in March of 2020, the ETA of Iowa chapter voted to begin inducting a small number of junior initiates each year, students whose investments in their liberal arts path were already reflecting Phi Beta Kappa's mission and commitment to excellence. These junior members will become student leaders in the organization during their senior year, invited to chapter meetings, and encouraged to participate in chapter events, including welcoming the Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar. This year's 4 junior inductees are Kyle Brusco, Katie Fetting, Emily Lehman, Catalin Swanson. Let us welcome and acknowledge these new members of Phi Beta Kappa. In addition to the students whose names I have just read, I also want to recognize 3 seniors who were inducted last year as part of our inaugural class of junior inductees: Nicholas Behrens, May Cody, and Emma Keel. Again, congratulations to you all. While the challenges of 2020 left us without a formal induction ceremony, we were pleased to have inducted Dr. John Moeller, Emeritus Professor of Political Science, as our 2020 honorary member and distinguished speaker. We wanted to recognize his induction today. In lieu of his lecture, he wrote a kind note to last year's cohort, welcoming them to the organization and sharing a message of resilience. This year, we have the privilege of welcoming a noted Luther alumna, Dr. Nancy Jones, class of 1969, to present the Ruth A. Davis Memorial Lecture. To tell of Nancy Jones's achievements, I call upon Martin Clammer.
Thank you, Marie. Our speaker today, Dr. Nancy Jones, was director of the Writing Resource Center at the University of Iowa College of Law from 1990 until her retirement last summer. Nancy Jones is a longtime friend of Luther College. Dr. Jones graduated summa cum laude from Luther in 1969 with a degree in English. She earned a master's degree in teaching from Brown University and a PhD in English from the University of Iowa with a specialization in the teaching of writing. Prior to her teaching career at Iowa, Dr. Jones taught junior high and high school English in Rhode Island, as well as at American schools in Germany and England. She also taught English as a second language to adult students in Spain and France. In 1974 to 75, Dr. Jones was an instructor of English at Luther College, where she served as acting director of the Study Skills Center. Before her work at the law school, Dr. Jones taught undergraduates and graduate students at Iowa, taught over 400 public school teachers and administrators throughout the state as part of the Iowa Writing Project, and was a staff member for the Institute on Writing, funded by the University of Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, as a training program for directors of freshman composition throughout the United States. In 1990, Nancy Jones created the Writing Resource Center at the University of Iowa College of Law. It was the first law school-based writing center in the country. She directed the center for 30 years, working with students, faculty, and staff as a writing coach, in-house expert on the English language, and editorial resource for anyone needing help with their writing. Over the years, she also offered writing workshops and continuing legal education programs to lawyers, judges, and paralegals throughout the state. In 2017, Dr. Jones received the University of Iowa's Hancher-Finkbein Medallion, one of the highest honors the university bestows on faculty and professional staff in recognition of their leadership, learning, and loyalty. Dr. Jones is a friend of many folks at Luther, including Professor Nancy Berry, with whom she taught at Iowa in the English department and rhetoric program. On a personal note, I myself know Nancy Jones and her husband, Michael Hovland, a 1972 graduate of Luther, from the early 90s in Iowa City, when their now grown sons, Sven and Bjorn, were just toddlers. So, for personal and professional reasons, I am very happy to introduce to you our Phi Beta Kappa speaker, Dr. Nancy Jones, who will speak on Reflections on a Professional Life.
Thank you very much, Martin, for those kind words. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be with you young people today and other members of the broader Luther community on the occasion of our induction into Luther's chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. I'm quite honored to be joining you as we become members of this illustrious honor society, however many years separate us as Luther students. I graduated from the college in 1969, 52 years ago this spring. Much has changed in the world since then, of course. Back in the late 60s, there were no personal computers or cell phones or internet or Google Translate or text messages, much less abbreviations like LOL, TLDR, or IMHO. Items in grocery stores did not include barcodes to be scanned. Microwave ovens would not become mainstream for another 5 years, and the Sony Walkman was still a decade away. The world would not experience the first groundbreaking Star Wars movie for another 8 years, nor begin playing Pac-Man and Tetris until the 1980s, with Pokemon and Super Smash Bros. Not arriving on the scene until the late 1990s, and Call of Duty somewhat later still. My sons, Sven and Bjorn, would be so proud of their mother for even knowing the names of any video games. Here on campus, back in 1969, first-year students, at that time referred to as freshmen, wore beanies for the first weeks of their fall semester to distinguish them from everyone else, as if their looks of occasional bewilderment didn't already give that away. Young women had hours, the times you were required to be back in the dorm on given nights, 10 p.m. weeknights, 11 on weekends. But young men did not. As one of my professors explained this discrepancy, if the women are back in their dorms, there's no reason for the men not to be back in theirs. We women also had lights out 30 minutes after we were to be in our rooms. Many of us used up lots of flashlight batteries that year, studying late under the covers, so none of the RAs could detect any light coming through the space at the bottom of the door. If you needed to call home, you could wait your turn at the one phone for outgoing calls near the front desk in whatever dorm you lived. And that's the phone your parents and friends called when they wanted to reach you as well. When you went to the library, you did not go to the spacious Preuss Library, which opened the fall after I graduated, but you went to Cozy Corin, where I spent many an evening in the stacks. CFL didn't exist back then, so we had chapel and church services and Messiah rehearsals and performances and other musical events in the field house, as I recall. So a lot has changed here since I graduated, these many years ago, but some things have not. The Oneota Valley, seen from the Union, is as glorious as ever. Faculty members continue to produce exciting research, as the pages of Agora regularly attest. Students, at least pre-pandemic and surely in months ahead, are challenged to branch out through international programs in countries around the world. And the commitment to living responsible lives seems deeply rooted here, whether in the face of climate change or in reaction to racial injustices. So too is the commitment of faculty and staff to the lives of individual students, their desire to provide them with an education for life and to model the truth that the life of the mind and the life of faith can work hand in hand. I could give you many examples of such commitment to me on the part of Luther faculty and staff members, but I'll mention only one this afternoon. When I was a senior, I found myself walking one afternoon in front of Maine, where the English department was housed and many of my classes were held. Not much has changed there. Professor Mary Lou Moore, dear Mary Lou, who would be instrumental in the founding of Luther's Phi Beta Kappa chapter in 1983, was also walking nearby and made a point of coming over to me. By then, she had heard that I had been accepted into the MAT program at Brown University, where I'd get a degree that would qualify me to teach junior high or high school English in the public schools. She jumped right to her point. Nancy, I think you should consider working toward a PhD so you could teach at the college level. While it's not at all unusual today for young women to hold such goals, it wasn't all that common among my circle of friends at Luther in 1969. I remember feeling honored that Mary Lou felt I was capable of aiming that high, though it would be a number of years before I took her up on the implied challenge, and longer yet before I ended up at the front of college and professional school classrooms. After getting my degree at Brown, I did what countless other young people were doing in those days. I headed off to see the world, or at least Western Europe. I bought a backpack to carry everything I'd need for 3 months, purchased traveler's checks to cash along the way. If you want to know what traveler's checks were, most anyone over 50 or 60 could explain them to you. Told my friends and family where American Express offices I'd be visiting were over the coming months, where I'd be able to pick up any mail they sent me. Remember, there were no smartphones for keeping in touch. Bought a Eurail pass that would allow me to board virtually any train at a moment's notice once I got to Europe, and bought a round-trip ticket to Amsterdam on Iceland Air, following in the footsteps of thousands of other college-age students and recent graduates with Frommer's Europe on $5 a day in hand. What I also carried with me was the energy and sense of adventure and fascination with the world that my liberal arts education gave me in spades. I wanted to see the art museums that my freshman course in art from Professor Orville Running had whetted my appetite for. The Louvre, the Prado, the Rijksmuseum, for example, along with a foray to Florence and its Uffizi Gallery, the Galleria dell'Accademia with its David, and the Museum of the History of Science, not to mention Frogner Park in Oslo. I wanted to visit the countries that had produced Homer, Goethe, and Shakespeare, authors whose works I had read in Core, the predecessor to Paideia. I wanted to go to La Scala in Milan, the Teatro Real in Madrid, and the Royal Albert Hall in London, all places that figured in the music appreciation course I took from Professor Bart Butler at Luther. Not to mention London's West End, for the theater that was central to many of my English courses at Luther. I realized soon enough that 3 months wasn't going to give me nearly enough time to fit all of this in. So, footloose and fancy-free, I decided to forego my return flight and stay in Europe longer, for 4 years to be exact. In those years, I taught English in Madrid to businessmen and to young women hoping to be hired by Iberia Airlines. Taught English to Arab students in Dijon, France, while studying French, and taught junior high and high school students at a U.S. Air Force base near Zweibrücken, West Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany was still almost 20 years away. This base near Zweibrücken was a NATO base that had been rented out to the Canadians before the U.S. Air Force, and there were beautiful maple trees everywhere. Also, a base commander who did not understand young people. He wanted all the students, K through 12, to walk on the sidewalks between scattered school buildings rather than on the grass or in the street. Good luck with that, as they say. This was also where I learned that the ways of the military can be inscrutable. One day, the high school band director came into my classroom in great excitement, saying he'd received word that a large shipment had arrived with "band" written on the outside of multiple large boxes. He was hoping this included the music and music stands he'd been waiting for months. But no, the military had shipped him 12 bass drums, which he'd never asked for, instead. Go figure. I also worked for a couple of years as a high school guidance counselor at Lakenheath, England, a U.S. military base north of Newmarket, a small town considered to be the birthplace of thoroughbred horse racing. I had to carefully time my commute from my Newmarket apartment to the base to make sure I left before all traffic was stopped, sometimes for as much as 20 minutes, so that the thoroughbred horses could cross the road, the main thoroughfare from London to the north of Suffolk, from their stables on the east to the heath where they were exercised and ran on the west. The military base was where I met one of the falconers on the military payroll, an officer who released falcons before the enormous transport planes took off from or landed at Mildenhall Air Base to frighten away other birds and prevent them from being sucked into the engines and causing planes to crash. Not an impossibility, as we learned many years later when Captain Chesley Sullenberger landed U.S. Airways Flight 1549 on the Hudson River in New York City, after both engines of the plane were struck by a flock of Canada geese. My life in those years, peripatetic as it was varied and very satisfying. I'm grateful to have had those experiences, and I've returned to those memories often in the years since. But life moves along, and I returned to the States, spent a year teaching part-time at Luther, and then headed off to the University of Iowa to get my PhD in English, just as Mary Lou Moore had urged me to do 7 years earlier. My life in Iowa City, much more stationary than my life in Europe, also held its own series of adventures, and I'll focus on one of those in just a few minutes. Much of my attention in my degree program was the teaching of writing, and I had the opportunity, as Martin Clammer mentioned, to work with a range of populations in my early years at the university. Undergraduate and graduate students, directors of freshman English programs from across the country. I was a staff member at the Institute on Writing there, a joint program of the university and the National Endowment for Humanities, and K through 12 teachers and administrators across the state whom I taught in summer writing projects, workshops in the State of Iowa Writing Project over the course of 12 years. Through all these experiences and through ever so many conversations over time with members of the general public, I've come to see that the surest way to elicit silence is to tell someone that you teach writing. At best, you may get a nervous laugh in response, or a confession about writing being something that the person you're talking with has tried to avoid. I imagine it's something like the reaction dentists get when announcing what they do. Many people, too many people, have had poor experiences with writing, going back perhaps to red-inked notes on papers from teachers in the schools, bleeding across the pages, as it were, that it takes a certain amount of fortitude to overcome. So what happens when you suddenly find yourself working with students whose academic program features writing at the center of so much of what they do? That's the world I found myself in beginning in 1990, when the dean of the College of Law asked if I'd like to begin shaping a writing center there. It was a wonderful opportunity to direct the first law school-based writing center in the country. And that's the work I continued to do for 30 years until I retired last year in the early months of the pandemic, just before all instruction at the university went remote. As a result, I never became proficient at Zoom teaching, by the way, or anything having to do with Zoom. So I'm mighty glad to have expert IT setup and backup here today. While the examples that follow are law school and lawyer specific, what I have to say about writing is relevant to virtually any field you might choose to enter, to virtually every profession and career. The importance of writing never goes away. In the time we have left here, just consider me your Sherpa as I guide you through some reminders, strategies, and recommendations for the writing tasks you will face. When I accepted the law dean's invitation 31 years ago now, I didn't know what I was getting in for. There were no writing centers that I knew of in any professional schools at the time, so there were no parallel models for me to work with. While I did have a doctorate, I didn't have a law degree, and the faculty, getting used to this new position in their midst themselves, made it quite clear that I was not to address the accuracy of students' writing when I worked with them. Something they needn't have worried about, as I wouldn't have known promissory estoppel or the rule of perpetuities or quantum meruit if they were to hit me over the head. The first months were something of a blur, but I was quite fortunate to have the help of Cameron Strocker, my associate director, a lawyer and graduate of the Writers' Workshop. When I asked Cameron early on to look at a few paragraphs from a student's memo, I said to him, "Do I not understand this because I don't understand the law or because it's just poorly written?" And I remember the great relief I felt when he said, "Oh, this is terribly written. I think I understand the law and can't make heads nor tails of the prose." It didn't take me long to realize that while I didn't know what I was getting into when I took the position at the law school, the majority of law students didn't know what they were getting into when going to law school either. Many were first-generation students without lawyers in their extended family, while others had absorbed the popular view of lawyers from novels by John Grisham or Scott Turow, or TV shows such as Law and Order and Boston Legal. To be immersed in these elements of popular culture would convince a person that lawyers can out-talk anyone in the room, argue with energy and drama wherever they happen to be, and have very complex personal lives. What such fictionalized accounts and televised trials fail to convey is that lawyers write, and they usually write a lot. As Jay Topkus, a lawyer in residence at the law school and a top-flight New York City litigator, said to my staff early on one fall, "I realize every day I practice law that I must write and that I must care agonizingly about every word I put on the page." So began my years helping law students care about every word they put on the page. I realized early on that first-year law students are at a great disadvantage when it comes to writing. For one thing, they are entering a world with a vocabulary they know little about. They're excited and alert, but they make mistakes they would never make under normal circumstances. It's something like traveling in a new country where you don't really know the language. The upside is that it can be exhilarating with your senses particularly alive. The downside is that it can be frustrating, even if sometimes amusing to others. Early on during my time in Spain, for example, I was in a group of international and Spanish students at a college in Madrid, all of us talking about the places we call home. Now, in Spanish, the words winter and hell are identical except for one phoneme. I remember the laughter that ensued when I inadvertently said that hell in Iowa is much worse than hell in Madrid. The other writing problem for first-year students is that they're asked to write about subjects they don't know much about, and in some cases don't care much about either. Don't get me wrong. They care about doing well in their classes and they want to learn. But if you're not particularly keen on contracts or civil procedure or property, let's say, and don't really understand the subject matter all that well, but have to write about it anyway, you've got two strikes against yourself right off the bat. In such circumstances, members of my staff and I would help writers clarify their thinking by asking questions, getting a writer to explain the logic in moving from one paragraph to another, if we couldn't otherwise discern it, having them rephrase sentences that didn't make sense to us, having them tell us how they would explain a particular section to a family member or friend back home, rather than to the all-knowing professor. To take away the fear of the audience often produces amazing and clarifying results. We never addressed accuracy, as I mentioned before, but dealt with everything else, such that I often said that our aim for students as they left the Writing Center was that their writing be perfectly clear. It might be completely wrong, but it would be clearly wrong, making it much easier for their professors, incidentally, to know where the thinking problems happen to be. Just as writing is central to so much of what lawyers and law students do, so too is persuasion central to so much of what lawyers and law students write. An office memo will aim to persuade lawyers in the firm that your memo accurately conveys a reasonable assessment of a client's situation and has extracted from case law the pertinent parallel cases that will guide the court's decision if the case goes to trial. A legal brief will aim to persuade a court that your client is in the right before the law, worthy of prevailing in the case at hand. And then there are all the letters and motions that get sent and filed to move a case along and, wherever possible, place your client in an advantageous position. To understand the scope of such persuasion and the scope of work I undertook in the Law School's Writing Center, I'd like to shift gears and turn very briefly to Aristotle's rhetoric and his theory of persuasion. Aristotle wrote the rhetoric during the 4th century BCE while living in Athens. Because Athenian democracy called every free male into politics, every Athenian man had to be ready to stand in the assembly and speak to persuade his countrymen to vote for or against a particular piece of legislation. It was in the context of speaking effectively and persuasively that the rhetoric had its focus, though the principles apply to writing effectively or persuasively as well. According to Aristotle, there are 3 elements of any act of discourse: a subject, an audience, and a speaker or writer. And corresponding to each of these elements is an artistic form of persuasion or proof. With the subject, there is the persuasion inherent in logic, logos. With the audience, the persuasive power of emotion, pathos. And with the speaker, writer, the persuasive power of one's character, ethos. Thus, according to this model, you can prove your point, persuade your audience through logic, through emotional appeals, and through the quality of your character. Note that Aristotle refers to these as artistic forms of persuasion, those supplied by the speaker's or writer's creation. Beyond these artistic forms are the non-artistic ones, such as threats and torture, which of course could persuade someone to do what you'd like them to do, but aren't at all artistic. Within the law school, the power of logical reasoning holds considerable sway. The power, that is, of proving a truth, real or apparent, by argument. Class after class calls students to defend a position, find the logical arguments on which the position is based, and through always rigorous and sometimes excruciating public examination, hone one's arguments. We all have examples from our own lives of someone trying to persuade by logic. One of our favorite family stories involves our older son, Sven, who decided to take a few classes at Kirkwood Community College after high school as he tried to figure out what to do with his life. He was a little slow in signing up, and by the time he tried to get into a general education literature class, the classes at times convenient for him had closed. So he went to the office of one of the instructors and said he'd like to take her class. "Why should I let you in?" he reported. She asked him. "This class is already full." And apparently, without missing a beat, Sven replied, "Well, I had to grow up without cable, so I read a lot." She must have found the argument compelling because she let him in. He may also have been appealing to her emotions, trying to elicit sympathy for his life of deprivation. Of course, logic isn't the only way that we persuade one another. One powerful additional means is through appealing to your audience's emotions. Thus, in a legal brief, you try to favorably predispose your readers toward your client, painting the client in a sympathetic light, diminishing the power of unflattering information by hiding it in the middle of paragraphs rather than in positions that garner more attention, such as the beginning and end of paragraphs. In the Writing Center, we worked with students to tell the story of their client using narrative to highlight qualities that would make the client a sympathetic character, appealing to the audience. So, for example, imagine that you represent a mother who fears for her child's safety, doesn't trust the child's father, from whom she is divorced, and in light of this distrust, has hidden the child from him. The father sues the mother for interfering with his custodial rights. To set the stage and give your audience reason to be sympathetic to the mother, you might phrase the question presented, that is the very first part of the legal brief that your readers would see, accordingly. Was the trial court correct in refusing to recognize a claim for custodial interference against a child's mother and refusing to award damages to the other jointly custodial parent? Notice that the writer accords the mother that term, mother, along with the link to her child, the child's mother, whereas the father is referred to as the other jointly custodial parent. The former tugs at the heartstrings. The latter, wooden and cold, certainly does not. So right off the bat, we are drawn to the mother, precisely what her attorney would want. Or take another pair of examples from a case in the late 60s, Miller v. Amusement Enterprises, Inc. At issue is whether the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title II, prohibits racial discrimination in amusement parks. The trial court said no. The appellate court, 2 years later, said yes. Using facts strategically, persuasively to help justify or set the tone for their differing decisions, the two courts present the plaintiffs in quite different lights. Incidentally, court opinions often lift language verbatim from the briefs submitted by attorneys for one or both parties, and such borrowing is not considered plagiarism. In fact, attorneys are pleased to have the court use their language without attribution. It's often a mark of pride. First, from the opinion by the trial court in 1966. And another aside, some of the language back in the 60s was different from the language we'd use today. On March 1st, 1965, plaintiff, Mrs. Patricia B. Miller, took her two children to Funfair Park in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, intending to use the ice skating facilities which were then in operation. Upon their arrival at Funfair Park, the attendant, believing that one of the children who requested a pair of skates was a white child, handed her a pair of skates. Thereafter, upon learning that both of the children were Negroes, the attendant retrieved the skates and informed the plaintiffs that the facilities of Funfair Park were privately owned and were open for use by white people only. I'd say that's a rather dispassionate rendering of a situation that would seem foreign to us in 2021, but that the trial court apparently found unremarkable back in 1966. But look at how the appellate court told the story in its 1968 opinion, by including and framing additional information from the record in support of its decision that the Civil Rights Act did indeed prohibit such racial discrimination. Mrs. Miller, in response to Funfair's advertisement that everybody come, took her two children, Daniel, age 12, and Denise, age 9, to the park to ice skate. At the skate rental counter, she asked for skates for Denise, who has a fair or light complexion, and the attendant, thinking the little girl was white, promptly handed Mrs. Miller a pair of skates. Daniel, dark complexioned, who had been sent back to the Miller car for heavy socks, then joined his mother and sister. The rented skates were soon discovered to be too small, and Mrs. Miller returned to the rental stand and placed the skates on the counter. In the meantime, the attendant had discovered that the child was Negro, and he had left the skate room to inform the manager of the situation. As the manager approached the counter, Mrs. Miller stated to him that the skates did not fit. The manager snatched the skates off the counter and announced to Mrs. Miller that Funfair did not serve colored. The people standing in line waiting to rent skates began to giggle, and Denise, frightened and disappointed at not being allowed to skate, started crying. As Denise stood there crying, others in line appeared to be amused. Mrs. Miller and her children quickly left the park. What we have here is a very different story, of course, in which we are invited to feel sympathy for little Denise, frightened and disappointed, and none whatsoever for the representative of the amusement park who snatched the skates off the counter and announced that Funfair did not serve colored. What the trial and appellate courts have done is prepare us for their differing decisions by eliciting different emotional responses from us in the way they present the facts of the case. In the first instance, by not finding any legal problem with the behavior of Funfair. In the second instance, finding that the establishment had engaged in racial discrimination, action the court held was prohibited by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Again, these versions are probably identical to what lawyers for each side had used in their briefs. In the first case, hoping to convince the court to absolve Funfair of any responsibility. In the second case, trying to elicit sympathy from the court about the plight of this Black family just trying to have a good time. So much of my work in the center was teaching about these appeals to emotion and helping writers negotiate this persuasive strategy, while not becoming hyperbolic, nor calling into question their own integrity. And that brings us to the third means of persuasion that Aristotle talked about, along with appeals to a logic and to emotion: ethos, or the character of the speaker or writer himself or herself. The way you present yourself in writing or speaking has persuasive power of its own. You aim for qualities that engender trust and inspire confidence, such that your audience will be inclined to listen carefully, even agree with, even act on what you have to say. Sometimes your reputation and credentials precede you and can help your persuasiveness. When the Iowa State Supreme Court holds hearings and cases at the law school, which they do once every year, the audience is alert and highly respectful, knowing the power of the justices' positions and the authority they carry by virtue of who they are. Not many of us are or will be justices, of course, but we all have ways of inspiring confidence in those who hear or read what we have to say. Inspiring such confidence, establishing your credibility, means knowing the rules of the road, as it were, how citations are presented, what kind of support you need for arguments, how you effectively conduct research in your field. It also means being attentive to the needs of your audience, doing what you can not to bore them, nor exhaust them, nor make them wish they were listening to or reading something else. It was in this context that I taught students strategies for making their sentences energetic, thereby more engaging, generally using the more forceful verb-based rather than noun-based constructions that we call nominalizations. Why take actions when you can simply act? There's no reason to make assumptions instead of assume. Why have a collision instead of collide? No reason to commit a violation rather than violate. And why interpose an objection instead of object? It's also within this context that I taught students to avoid throat clearing. That is, long wind-ups, extraneous words, and unnecessarily repetitive language. So instead of writing, "the second defendant is plainly and unequivocally innocent," go with the shorter and more direct, "the second defendant is innocent." Similarly, instead of writing, "there are several facts that must be confirmed by that witness," try the more active and concise version. "That witness must confirm several facts." Even if brevity is not as highly valued in your field as it is in law, concise constructions are generally easier for readers to process, making their reading less of a struggle, something for which readers will thank you. Readers will also thank you if you avoid annoying errors, such as confusing ITS and IT''S, or mistaking effect with an E with effect with an A, writing a lot as one word rather than two. We never write a little as one word, nor should we with a lot. Similarly, it's best to be alert for mixed and misplaced modifiers, which, while humorous, are distracting. Consider the following that crossed my desk at one time or another. Though only 18, the judge found the young defendant guilty on all charges. Who was 18? Exhausted, the boat was too difficult for Ellen to manage. How do you know a boat is exhausted? Sometimes you just have to sit in the other guy's shoes. Now, try to picture that. Or this one, in trying to reach an agreement, the employee felt he was beating his head against a dead horse. You can never anticipate everything for which readers will thank you, but if you always have your readers in mind, these strategies provide a good start. Finally, it's within this context of establishing credibility and being attentive to your audience that I gave presentations and worked with students on plain English, the movement to make legal writing more intelligible and accessible to the greatest number of intended readers. Traditional legal writing, or legalese as it is known, has been described by David Melenkoff in The Language of the Law as wordy, unclear, pompous, and dull. And quite fittingly, law books have been described as the largest body of poorly written literature ever created by the human race. That's John Lindsay in The Legal Writing Malady, Causes and Cures. So, more felicitous alternatives are greatly to be desired. Consider this wordy, cumbersome, legalese-laced sentence of 58 words. Now, just bear with me. It is hereby covenanted and agreed that any claims, disputes, or controversies arising subsequent to the signing of this agreement, and which arise out of or concern for the aforestated terms, provisions, or conditions of this agreement, shall be subject to all applicable laws prevailing in the state of Michigan, as applied by a court of competent jurisdiction. And in contradistinction, its 5-word plain English translation, Michigan law governs this contract. I would urge you to become in the habit of recognizing the jargon in your own fields, perhaps not as dramatic as legalese happens to be, but perhaps still as off-putting and dense to those about to read what you have to write. If you can find plain English alternatives more accessible to your audience, they will be grateful, and I do believe, more inclined to think well of you. And which of us doesn't want that? And that in turn increases your credibility and persuasiveness. After 30 years at the law school, there is much more I could say, but time is short, and I'm aware that my audience is ready for this to move along. I hope that in years hence, when you look back on your lives after Luther, you will be able to say that you seized opportunities that presented themselves to you, that you made a difference in a small corner of the world, and that you gratefully and gracefully carried with you throughout your lives the gifts that Luther has given you: curiosity about the world, a fascination with the life of the mind, respect for the energizing power of the liberal arts across the natural sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts, and the faith that Luther's faculty and staff have placed in you, including the affirmation that your fine work at Luther has entitled you to become a member of Phi Beta Kappa. All of these gifts from Luther are bequests that will fortify you along the road ahead. Circuitous, rocky, or unpredictable as it might be, I wish you well, each of you, with the adventures that await.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for your message. And we congratulate you on your honorary membership to the Ada of Iowa chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. We will now conclude our virtual facet of this induction. Special thanks goes to Kristen Underwood, Diane Gossman, and all the others working behind the scenes to make this event possible. We welcome our initiates, chapter members, and other faculty and staff to join us inside the CFL lobby, where students can receive their certificates and get their pictures taken. Thank you for wearing your mask as you join us.